The hearing I am describing took place on a Tuesday evening in late October. The room was a repurposed community center with fluorescent lights and folding chairs. Maybe 30 people were present. The matter on the agenda was a variance request for the construction of a private tennis pavilion on a residential lot in one of the wealthier neighborhoods on the north side of the city. The request had been filed by a developer on behalf of the homeowner, but the homeowner herself had come to speak, which was unusual. Most people sent their attorneys. Her name, and I will change it, as I change all names in these accounts, was Diane Calloway. She was in her early 50s, well-dressed in a way that communicated expense without effort, the kind of woman whose coat alone probably cost more than the chairperson's monthly mortgage payment. She arrived with a leather portfolio and a man I initially assumed was her lawyer, but who turned out to be her husband's project manager. Her husband, Richard Calloway, was a commercial real estate developer whose name appeared on several mixed-use buildings downtown. He was not present. He had, according to Diane, more pressing obligations. The opposition was a woman named Margaret Chizek. She was 63, recently retired from a career as a county librarian, and she lived in the house directly adjacent to the Calloway property. Margaret's concern was straightforward. The proposed tennis pavilion, which included a semi-enclosed structure with lighting, would sit 14 feet from her property line, well within what she believed violated the setback requirements for accessory structures. She had filed a written objection 30 days prior, as the process required. She had also brought photographs, a site survey she had paid for out of her own pocket, and a highlighted copy of the municipal code. I should say something about Margaret because she matters more than you might initially think. She was not an activist. She was not litigious. She was a person who had lived in her house for 27 years and who understood, from decades of quiet civic participation, how these processes were supposed to work. She had served on the library board. She had volunteered at municipal events. She trusted institutions because she had given her time to them. This is important because it explains why she did not approach the hearing as a fight. She approached it as a procedure. She believed that if the code said one thing and the proposal contradicted it, the code would hold. That was, to her, the entire point of having a code. Diane Calloway believed something different. Not explicitly, she would never have said it aloud, but everything about her conduct communicated it. She believed the hearing was a formality. She believed her presence was a courtesy she was extending to the process, not something the process required of her. When she sat down, she did not look at the board members. She looked at her phone. When the chairperson opened the matter and invited the applicant to present, she stood and smiled in a way that assumed the room was already on her side. Her presentation was polished. She had renderings. She had a letter from a landscape architect. She described the pavilion as an enhancement to the neighborhood's aesthetic character. She used the phrase property value improvement 3 times. She mentioned, without being asked, that her husband had contributed to the city's downtown revitalization, as though this were relevant to a setback variance. She mentioned the name of the mayor in passing, noting they had attended the same fundraiser 2 weeks prior. She was not nervous. She was performing generosity, offering the board a chance to approve something she considered inevitable. Then Margaret spoke. She stood slowly, holding a manila folder that she had clearly organized with care. She did not have renderings or a landscape architect's letter. She had the municipal code, section 14.3.2, printed and highlighted. She had the site survey showing the proposed structure at 14 feet from the shared property line. She read the code provision aloud. Accessory structures in residential zones required a minimum setback of 20 feet from any adjacent lot line. She placed the survey on the table. She placed the code beside it. She said, "The numbers do not match. That is my concern." She sat down. What happened next is the part I have thought about for years because it was so small and yet so revealing. Diane, who had been leaning back in her chair with her legs crossed, let out a short laugh. Not a loud laugh, not a cruel laugh, a dismissive one, the kind of sound a person makes when they believe someone has fundamentally misunderstood the situation. She turned slightly to the project manager beside her and said something I could not hear, but the expression on her face was unmistakable. It was amusement. She found Margaret's presentation, the manila folder, the highlighted code, the careful reading, quaint. The chairperson, a man named Gerald Hofstadt, who owned a plumbing supply business and had served on the board for 11 years, noticed the laugh. He did not react to it. He simply looked at Diane for a moment longer than was comfortable, then turned to the board. Does the applicant wish to respond to the objection regarding the setback requirement? Diane stood again. Of course, she said, still smiling. We have already discussed the setback with the City Planning Office. Our understanding is that the variance is exactly what we are requesting and that the board has wide discretion to grant it when the project serves the community's interest. She paused. We are not asking to do anything that diminishes the neighborhood. Quite the opposite. Gerald nodded slowly. Then he said something that changed the temperature of the room. Mrs. Calloway, just to clarify, when you say you discussed this with the City Planning Office, can you tell us who you spoke with and whether that conversation is documented? Diane's smile did not disappear, but it became fixed. I would have to check with our project team on the specifics. Gerald made a note. We will need that documentation submitted to the board before we can consider it. Verbal assurances from unnamed officials are not part of our record. This was not an attack. It was procedure. It was the kind of thing a zoning board chairperson says routinely. But Diane received it as something else. She received it as a challenge to her credibility, which, to be fair, it was, but only because she had offered her credibility as the primary basis for the request. She had not brought the code. She had not addressed the setback number. She had brought prestige, and Gerald had calmly noted that prestige was not a filed document. The hearing continued. A board member named Sandra Torres, a retired civil engineer, asked a technical question about the drainage implications of the proposed structure. Diane turned to her project manager, who answered competently but revealed under Sandra's questioning that no stormwater assessment had been conducted. Sandra did not editorialize. She simply noted that one would be required and asked that it be included in any resubmission. Another board member asked about the lighting plan. The pavilion included overhead lighting for evening use. The member asked whether a photometric study had been submitted showing the light spill onto neighboring properties. It had not. Each question was calm. Each question was procedural. And each question removed one more pillar from beneath the assumption that this was a foregone conclusion. Diane's posture changed incrementally. The crossed legs uncrossed. The phone disappeared into her bag. The smile became thinner. She began answering with shorter sentences. At one point, she said, I think we may be overcomplicating this. Gerald looked at her and said simply, This is the process, Mrs. Calloway. Margaret did not speak again during any of this. She did not need to. Her single presentation, the code, the survey, the numbers, had established the framework, and every subsequent question from the board was, in essence, an expansion of her point. She had not argued. She had not pleaded. She had held up a ruler next to a claim and let the measurement speak. The board members were not punishing Diane. They were doing their jobs. But their jobs, done properly, were sufficient to dismantle an approach built entirely on assumed deference. The moment I remember most vividly came near the end. Gerald announced that the board would be tabling the variance request pending the submission of the required documentation, the stormwater assessment, the photometric study, the record of communication with the planning office, and a revised site plan demonstrating compliance or justification for the setback deviation. He read the list slowly and clearly as though he were reading a receipt. Diane stood, and what she said next was the thing that silenced the room. She said, Mr. Hofstadt, my husband has invested significantly in this city. I would hope the board would take that into consideration. Gerald paused. He removed his reading glasses. He looked at her for what felt like a very long time, but was probably 4 or 5 seconds. Then he said, Mrs. Calloway, this board considers applications. We do not consider investments, relationships, or reputations. If your application meets the criteria, it will be approved. If it does not, it will not. That is the same standard we apply to every resident of this city. The room did not erupt. No one clapped. No one stood. But something had been made visible that could not be made invisible again. Diane had revealed in front of 30 people the operating assumption beneath her entire presentation that her husband's money entitled her to a different process. And Gerald, without raising his voice, without insulting her, without performing any kind of justice theater, had simply declined to participate in that assumption. Diane gathered her portfolio. She said quietly, "We will resubmit." But the "we" sounded different now. It sounded smaller. She left the room without looking at Margaret. I spoke with Margaret briefly afterward in the parking lot. She was putting her folder into the passenger seat of a 10-year-old sedan. I asked her what she thought of the outcome. She said, "I thought it would go the way it was supposed to go." She said this without satisfaction, without triumph, without any of the vindication that a dramatic retelling would demand of her. She said it the way a person describes gravity. She expected the rules to apply because the rules exist to apply. I learned later that the Callaways did resubmit months afterward with a revised plan that moved the structure to 22 feet from the property line and included all the required documentation. The variance was approved in a routine hearing that lasted 12 minutes. Margaret attended but did not object. The revised plan met the code. She had no issue with a structure that followed the rules. Her objection had never been personal. What I carry from that evening is not the image of a wealthy woman being humiliated. That is the story people want, but it is not what actually happened. What happened was more subtle and, I think, more important. A woman who had organized her identity around proximity to power discovered, in a room with fluorescent lights and folding chairs, that there existed spaces where proximity to power was not currency. She discovered this not through a dramatic confrontation, but through the steady, unremarkable application of procedure by people who took their roles seriously. Gerald Hofstadt did not set out to teach anyone a lesson. Sandra Torres did not ask about stormwater drainage to prove a point. The board did not conspire to humble Diane Calloway. They simply treated her the way they treated everyone, and that equality of treatment experienced by someone who had come to expect preferential treatment felt like a demotion. It felt like loss. And in a sense it was, but what was lost was something she should not have had in the first place: the assumption that the rules were for other people. There is a version of this story that ends with Diane in tears, begging for mercy, publicly shattered. That version is satisfying in the way that sugar is satisfying, immediately and without nourishment. The real version ends with a woman walking to her car in a parking lot, carrying a leather portfolio, having learned something she may or may not choose to remember. It ends with the fluorescent lights being turned off and the folding chairs being stacked by a maintenance worker who was not present for any of it. It ends with Margaret driving home in her sedan, turning on the radio, thinking about what she might have for dinner. The machinery of fairness, when it works, is not dramatic. It is not cinematic. It does not produce villains or heroes. It produces something much harder to narrativize, but much more valuable: a room where the rules apply to everyone, and everyone knows it, and no one has to raise their voice to make it so. That is what I saw that Tuesday evening in October, and that is what I've been thinking about ever since, every time I hear someone laugh at a process they believe is beneath them. Because the process does not need to be respected to function. It only needs to be followed. And when it is followed by patient people in unremarkable rooms, it is more powerful than any fortune, any name, any connection, any assumption of untouchability. It is the quiet engine of the only equality that actually exists, the equality of being held to the same standard as the person sitting next to you, regardless of what you drove to get there.